Hello, this is Brian Oughton of Apologetics 315. Today's interview is with Thomas E. Woodward, professor at Trinity College of Florida and founder and director of the C.S. Lewis Society. He lectures in universities on scientific, apologetic, and religious topics. Dr. Woodward is also the author of Doubts About Darwin, Darwin Strikes Back, and co-author of The Mysterious Epigenome, What Lies Beyond DNA. The purpose of this interview is to explore some of the themes of Dr. Woodward's writing and research and his insights into intelligent design. Thanks for joining me, Dr. Woodward.
Glad to be with you.
Well, would you mind telling our listeners a bit about yourself and your work?
Well, sure. I have been teaching now for a little over 24 years at Trinity College of Florida, which is a Christian interdenominational college in Tampa, Florida. One of our best-known alumni is Billy Graham, graduate of the class of 1940, and we are focused on a variety of topics in our studies at Trinity College, and the area or division that I cover includes theology. It includes some elective courses on Old and New Testament, but my focus has been on the rhetoric of science and the history of science, particularly the creation, evolution, intelligent design waterfront. And so it's been my privilege to get to know many of the founders of the intelligent design movement in a personal relationship over the last 25 years. And it's been a lot of fun to cover that controversy and that debate and write a couple of books about it that have come out over the last 10 years. And so I teach in that area and also head up the C.S. Lewis Society, which is an apologetics organization which holds events and a weekly radio program which is heard in several areas in the U.S. It's been a lot of fun to be involved in bringing that society to Florida from the Princeton campus.
Well, Dr. Woodward, as founder and director of that C.S. Lewis Society, can you talk a bit more about your vision and your goals and point people to where they might find out a little bit more about it?
Sure. The C.S. Lewis Society really started and lasted for about 8 years on the Princeton University campus. And that's where I was as a student from 68 to 72, entered as an atheist and became a follower of the Christian faith of Christ personally in that time period. And as I heard about this society, I was always interested in their work in apologetics and presenting a credible case for the truth claims of Christian faith. And as I began teaching at Trinity College of Florida, after we were working with university students in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, I thought it would be really a wonderful opportunity to start a parallel organization. And that C.S. Lewis Fellowship had the goal of dealing with, that is, teaching and investigating the truth claims of the Christian faith vis-a-vis other worldviews that were in somewhat of a competition for the faith commitment of people in the university world. And as I worked on the C.S. Lewis Fellowship, it morphed into the C.S. Lewis Society with the blessing of the founders of the original group on the Princeton campus. And so we have revived the original Princeton C.S. Lewis Society and moved it to, let's say, more tropical clime than New Jersey. And our goal really is to investigate and to present all angles and aspects of the worldview clash or the worldview comparison between the Christian faith and, let's say, naturalism, New Age, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and so forth. And I've really enjoyed working with a wide variety of campus organizations, including InterVarsity and many other groups, and including many wonderful leaders such as James Sire, the author of The Universe Next Door.
Oh, very good. Well, let's talk a bit about intelligent design, which is an area that you've researched quite a bit. And in your book, Doubts About Darwin, it's basically a history of intelligent design. So can you sort of introduce ID for our listeners? What is intelligent design? And when we're talking about the ID movement, what are we talking about?
I'd be glad to break that down into basic understanding. And ID, intelligent design, is, of course, now abbreviated into ID, came into existence in the late 80s, and I traced the origins of it in that first book, Doubts About Darwin, which really follows the history of the Darwin and design, or Darwin versus design debate from the late 50s all the way through the early 2000s. The sequel, the volume 2, if you want to call it that, is Darwin Strikes Back, and that covers from the mid-90s to 2006. And those two books together as a kind of a two-part overview or two-part history of this debate tries to focus on all the arguments, the main leaders, the thinkers and authors, and various arguments and counter-arguments across both sides of that perspective or that debate point. Now, intelligent design has been often misdefined. It's really amazing how many scholars, even the Tim Keller, whose book, Reason for God and many other books, I admire his work greatly, but Tim Keller drops the ball a bit and misdefines it. And it's really not too hard to define intelligent design. It's the study of patterns in nature which are best explained by an intelligence or an intelligent agent and not by undirected natural processes such as natural selection. And the study of intelligent design really began with the work of Charles Thaxton, who is a chemist. He co-authored with two other scholars the book The Mystery of Life's Origin in 1984. The next year, 85, a very powerful book called Evolution, a Theory in Crisis appeared in England. And the next year in the U.S. it was published as well. Michael Denton is the author of Evolution, a Theory in Crisis. And as an agnostic biochemist and geneticist, he, in my view, just decimated. He powerfully critiqued in 8 or 10 areas of evidence and found virtually no good evidence for macroevolution, plenty of evidence, of course, for microevolution. And those two books, working in tandem, working together, really birthed the intelligent design movement. And it was Philip Johnson and then later Michael Behe and other scholars, some of them law professor in the case of Phil Johnson, but at a very highly ranked university, University of California at Berkeley, the Bolt Law School. Michael Behe, of course, a biochemist, tenured at Lehigh University, and many other scholars rising through the ranks and just finishing their PhDs joined this movement and helped to flesh it out. And among them, of course, is Bill Dembski, who developed the explanatory filter through which design can be empirically detected in nature. And so the movement is about 25 years old, maybe a bit more, depending on how you date the original ideas that shaped or formed the start of ID.
Well, I'm curious as to what sparked your own fascination with the subject of intelligent design and what drove you to delve into it.
My interest in intelligent design really began with the reading of Michael Denton's book, Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, and the other book by Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson. And that book, of course, The Mystery of Life's Origin, was focused just on the origin of the first cell. And I had been reading quite a bit in the area of fossil evidence. I had become focused on this in my own work with college students, first in the U.S. and then in the Dominican Republic. So I was giving fossil talks in Spanish at universities all over the Dominican Republic. And the more I focused on this new pair of books, I thought, wow, this is a genre that is, it's like moving from a one-story building into a high-rise or a skyscraper. The quality of these critiques of Darwinian evolution, or in the case of Thaxton, a critique of the chemical evolution theory of the first cell. These critiques were mammoth. They were massive. They were sophisticated, and I was drawn to them because I thought, here we have a level of scholarship which the other side seemed to be startled with or taken aback. There was kind of like a shock that moved out from Denton and Thaxton. And then pretty quickly, Philip Johnson, a law professor, was holding his own in debates with some of the leading evolutionary biologists on planet Earth, including Stephen Jay Gould, whose debate with Johnson at a meeting of scholars in 1989 I describe in my book, Doubts About Darwin. So the more I studied this area and the more I sent out my, you might think of it as a research program, and the branches or the tentacles of my research, as I shot out wider and wider, the more amazed I was how weak the empirical evidence for Darwinian evolution was, and how the signature of design seemed to be shouted by the DNA evidence. And I just felt that this was a whole field that was worthy of focus. And of course, in my doctoral research program, my very, very secular agnostic professors at the University of South Florida were equally fascinated and interested in this. And even though they had no theistic urge to, validate design, they encouraged me to cover the whole rhetorical history of the entire movement. And that's what I did. And that's what led to my book, Doubts About Darwin.
Well, excellent. I'm sure that anyone who's looked at intelligent design and heard the arguments back and forth, they realize that some people strongly oppose ID, and their reasons may be manifold. They might say stuff like it's not science, or it's just anti-evolution, it's creationism that's just undercover, or it's religious in some way, you name it. Can you talk a bit about the opposition to ID, and would you comment on where you think it's actually coming from?
Well, I do believe that that's an important part of the story, because the fascination, first of all, with intelligent design as the new kid on the block, which was not mentioning the Book of Genesis, because the Book of Genesis has a different kind of evidence, if you want, and I would call it evidence, but it's a communication from the Creator Himself kind of evidence. And so the evidence of physics or chemistry or biology or astronomy, that's scientific or natural science evidence. And so when intelligent design comes along and tries to use just good logical empirical induction and deduction and work with physical evidence and not even reference the Book of Genesis, even the New York Times was fascinated, for example, with Michael Behe. And they gave a very positive review of his book, Darwin's Black Box. I was shocked, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's about an 8. And I thought, oh, this is just unheard of. I mean, when in the world would New York Times be saying some nice things and then allowed Behe to write an op-ed, not once, not twice, but 3 times over a period of about 7 years. And it seemed like about 2003, 2004, and then on into the horrific Dover trial, which we may talk about that train wreck. But there was a turning. It was like a perception of danger. It's like the old, sci-fi flick, Lost in Space. Danger, Will Robinson, danger. And so it's like the circling of the wagons took place. Scientists began to grind their teeth and say this must be stopped in its tracks. They're capturing the hearts and the minds of young people. And so just a rhetorical war broke out, especially 2004, 2005. And I wrote about that, although it's not the exclusive focus. It's about 2 or 3 chapters of my book, Darwin Strikes Back, deals with that. And I think it's because they saw their framework of naturalism, which even C.S. Lewis saw as a terribly stifling and a priori deadening framework of thinking. If you just assume that nature is all that there is, and then just, that's your starting point, and your blockade in mental freedom comes in right there, then, no matter what the evidence is, evolution wins if you presuppose naturalism. Well, that's a terrible way of thinking. I mean, how can any free-thinking person even countenance that unless they have a private pipeline to ultimate reality which tells them by some revelation naturalism is true, which of course would be absurd because they don't believe in revelation. So they cannot know that naturalism is true. So intelligent design comes along and has this case for design. You can empirically detect design. And then the mandarins, the high authority, the elite in science see danger, and then they circle the wagons. And that's where this harsh rhetoric comes from. If intelligent design wins, it's the end of science. It's the end of American leadership in science if we give any kind of platform to this garbage. And the bulging veins and the red face is just, the image I have in my mind. And I even confronted a president of a local liberal arts college here in Tampa Bay. We were on a televised debate, and he had just written a terrible op-ed filled with errors, factual errors. And I confronted him, and I said, in the break between the segments of this TV debate, it was kind of a round table kind of debate, I said, how many articles did you read, or books of the key books of the ID movement did you read before that article that you wrote? And he said, I haven't read any of the books. I've read a couple of articles. And so it was, to me, almost anti-intellectualism was manifest, and yet kind of a desperate, determined urge to shut down ID through blanketing it with all kinds of allegations and misinformed accusations. And so that's why I was really motivated to write the second book, Darwin Strikes Back.
Well, in the course of 2-3 decades, what direction do you see the ID movement going nowadays?
Well, that's a very good question, because the future, I would say, is extremely bright for design theory for a couple of reasons. Number one, they are doing excellent, what I call bench research, biochemistry bench research. If you go out to the Biologic Institute in Seattle, Washington, and look at the work that Doug Axe has been doing, or Ann Gager. Doug Axe did very powerful postdoc work in Cambridge in England. Ann Gager did work at Harvard. And they are protein chemists, and they have been showing how difficult it is with just a matter of one or two, even 3 or 4 mutations to modify just one teeny side of a protein, just one crucial fold of a protein between two similar, supposedly related proteins. And so when you look at the work of, again, Biologic Institute and the work of Ralph Silke at the University of Wisconsin and the work of Michael Behe in his second book, The Edge of Evolution, we see that design science is taking a lead. We are actually leading the way in defining what evolution can do and what evolution, blind, undirected mutation, but selection evolution cannot do. And I think it's really exciting to see, even over about 15 years now since Behe's first book, Darwin's Black Box, was published, you find his ideas of irreducible complexity are constantly now being referenced in research literature. So his challenge, the challenge thrown down by that book, has been picked up. They are seeing that as a key challenge. And Behe, to his credit, has faithfully commented on every single one of these technical articles that mentions irreducible complexity. And he's come back and he says, well, I think that your arguments are very weak for these following 5 reasons. And he'll come back and give his response to these technical research articles. Well, to me, that's the future of design. It's not in the rhetorical mudslinging. It's in the quiet, efficient, very competent research being done by our best scientists, which are this research results are proving or demonstrating clearly the edge of what evolution can do. It's very minimal. It does a good job of breaking things. We know that. And what evolution cannot do, and that is create new proteins, even new grooves or critical active sites on proteins. And that's what we're learning, even through the work of Doug Axe, who's probably the most powerful design scientist in the world. And so I tell students, I said, just, continue to study both sides, learn the strongest arguments on both sides, and be excited about what science is showing us.
All right. Well, let's address just a quick bit of history about intelligent design, and to a subject that many atheists would gladly point to, and that's what you called the train wreck of the Dover trial. Would you kind of talk about what that was and why it was a train wreck, and maybe put to rest some misconceptions that people may have about it?
Surely. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on Dover just because it's an example of I would say a person in the general public who misunderstood design and thought they would use it as their own tool or weapon in an educational, or I should even say maybe religious educational war on, what they view to be the bad forces, the evil, wicked forces at work in society. And I'm sympathetic to what they're trying to do. But the Dover School Board voted in a policy which required originally that intelligent design would be mentioned by a teacher, not taught, again, but just mentioned. Very, very minimal mention, like 5 minutes mention. And students were referred to a book that was sitting on the library shelf. It wasn't even in the room itself. And then since the biology teachers refused to do that, so that the job then fell to, as I recall, the principal, who came in and read a statement and then left. Well, that minimal requirement just to mention intelligent design was viewed as just horrific by the ACLU and their allies, the National Center for Science Education. So they brought a lawsuit, and so the Kitzmiller versus Dover School Board, Debbie Kitzmiller was one of the parents that joined in this law school. And so this whole, I would say, misguided effort by the Dover School Board, because the intelligent design movement is led by the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, and the Discovery Institute sent out their representatives and urged that the Dover School Board drop this policy, because even Discovery Institute doesn't doesn't urge that local school boards require design theory to be taught. Rather, they urge that local school boards require that the scientific evidence be presented fairly in regard to the current popular theory of macroevolution. In other words, teach the controversy, teach the both sides of the existing controversy of the theory that already is the mainstream theory, the textbook theory. So even though the Discovery Institute does lead the world in research and education on design theory, they never have once espoused the view that design should be taught in schools, basically because it's a newer theory. It often cannot be fairly presented by hostile parties in the school system, and therefore it turns this into a political football. And so what happened is that the Dover people, the school board people, just refused to listen, refused to take strong, wise counsel, and they just headed on into the trial. And the John E. Jones, the judge, who was really not educated in science or history of science or philosophy of science, rendered not just on that school board issue, he knocked down the requirement and said it was illegal by constitutional standards, but he decided he would do a favor for the whole world, as it were, and wade into the broader question of whether intelligent design was a scientific theory, because some testimony was given by the evolutionary side. The design theory was not scientific theory at all. It was just a creationism masquerading as science. No, they used some of this rhetoric. And so Judge John E. Jones, rendered his statement or his decision, and Michael Behe pointed out that the day after he wrote that decision, there were at least 10 major factual errors, scientific factual errors in the John E. Jones decision, which declared that intelligent design is not science. And so when we have breathtaking incompetence of a judge, of an American judge, which of course was celebrated by Darwinists just internationally for about a year, until it was revealed about 9 or 10 months later that by a careful review of the manuscript, the Judge Jones decision had copy-pasted, it plagiarized the exact wording of the ACLU brief for 94% of the text of his decision was just copied right out of the plaintiff and his, official briefing of trial. So I thought it was just a particularly unhelpful and really rhetorically ignorant decision by Judge Jones, which was nevertheless taken to this day as absolute proof that intelligent design is worthless. Well, it was not really applicable beyond that little venue, that little section of Pennsylvania. It was just applicable to that area. And there have been a torrent of criticisms, even from secular legal scholars, that Judge John Jones didn't know what he was talking about and should never have taken on the mantle of being an arbiter of what is and is not science. So I think it was a demonstration of stupidity and lack of wisdom on many sides at many levels. So I guess we can learn from it.
Well, that's helpful history. But one of the questions I would like you to address is that very question of is ID scientific? You know, a lot of people will object to intelligent design, and that's the first words out of their mouth. Hey, this isn't science. This isn't scientific. Does that matter, and why, and how would you respond to that?
Well, sure. I mean, it's a very good question. What is science is the key question. And is that a scientific question, or is that a philosophical question? And I and all leading parties in the design scholarship movement would agree, 100% agree with each other, that the issue is really what is science. And if science is defined as the search for natural, strictly natural explanations for every phenomenon in nature, then, well, of course, by that definition, if you define it as the search for natural causes for all phenomena in nature, then, intelligent design, because it opens up the possibility of detecting intelligent causes. So then, therefore, ID is ruled out of court on a procedural matter, not because it fails to produce good results, just because it is judged by this arbitrary, philosophically loaded definition. But I think that's a very Isaac Newton would have balked at that definition of science. Boyle would have balked. Name any of the great scientists, 90%, 95% of the great scientists from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, even many of the great ones in the 1900s would balk at such a definition. It's a philosophically loaded, biased, very biased definition to say where science looks for the natural explanations or causes. We should look for the true explanations or causes. And we can detect, even in SETI, or we theoretically could detect, through SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, a signal that was produced by an intelligent civilization somewhere in our galaxy, in some star system. And if we can detect through actually looking at that signal and seeing a pattern of dots and dashes, which makes some mathematical or logical sense, we could infer an intelligence without knowing who it was. We can decipher hieroglyphics on the side of Egyptian tombs. We can look at the faces of 4 presidents of Mount Rushmore. And even without the historical data surrounding those hieroglyphs or something like that. And so intelligent design is a good, strong, rigorous science which applies what Bill Dembski calls the explanatory filter. You look for low probability, and he establishes a very conservative, what's called probability bound, universal probability bound to detect causation through intelligence. But you have to match it with a second criterion, and that is the specificity. You have to have a specified pattern that meets an independently targeted region of some ideal code or some ideal solution or some ideal form to meet a contextual requirement. And so I explain these issues in my chapter 10 on Dembski in Darwin Strikes Back. And I think that that's what makes science of design very rigorous, and it does pass the most rigid and rigorous tests of being good science. I think it's science of the future. It's a science with the blindfold ripped off.
Now, you mentioned various sort of big names, if you will, in the ID movement, and a couple of those, Bill Dembski, Michael Behe, and they both have had their impact in their own ways. And I wondered if you could sort of outline their formulations or approaches to ID and their uniqueness.
Well, surely. Michael Behe is one of the discoverers of, I believe, something called zDNA. It's a kind of a weirdly formatted or shaped or spirally bound DNA. And he, when he was hired by Lehigh University, was instantly granted tenure because of his achievements. When he was at Queens College in New York City and earlier with the NIH. So Behe is a bench DNA biochemist. Works on these areas of structure of biochemical systems all the time. And I think that Michael Behe, will be looked upon as the Galileo of future biological science because he has had the boldness to detect patterns in the molecular structures within cells, what are called systems or machines of irreducible complexity. And anyone who's really read at any level on intelligent design meets Michael Behe pretty quickly. One of the critics of design has said it's sort of like Plato. Philosophy is all about Plato. Everything else is footnotes. And they said intelligent design is all about Michael Behe. All the rest is footnotes. And that's an exaggeration, but I think it at least captures the core importance of Michael Behe. And so I recommend students or anybody out there interested in design to read both of his books, not only Darwin's Black Box, but also his sequel, The Edge of Evolution. If you read those books in tandem, it is an overwhelmingly powerful scientific aha moment, or two aha moments. And so I think that Michael Behe's work on in The Edge of Evolution shows exactly what evolution can do and cannot do. He's a bit of you might say, a left-wing intelligent design theorist because he does accept common ancestry tentatively, although he's willing to change that if the evidence indicates otherwise. Bill Dembski. Can we talk about Bill Dembski as a kind of a separate issue?
Sure.
Okay. I should say a separate person with separate research agendas. William Dembski is if I can be a bit exaggerating again and maybe a bit cheeky here, Bill Dembski is the Einstein of the ID movement, if there ever was one. He has more incredibly gifted and advanced intelligence that of anybody I've ever known, and I've had a very wonderful collection of smart professors, both at Princeton and in my doctoral program at USF, University of South Florida. And so William Dembski is a transcendently gifted mind. And with his double doctorate in math and also in philosophy of science, he has written the theoretically most important books of the design movement's history. His book, The Design Inference, was a celebrated peer-reviewed workbook published by Cambridge University in England. His follow-up books, the No Free Lunch book by Roman Littlefield, publisher, No Free Lunch, followed by The Design Revolution. And I can mention several other books that he co-authored, for example, The Design of Life, very, very powerful book. All of these books have sought to show that there is a principle detection system, that is a series of principles, series of logical steps that use mathematics and probability to some extent, but also use good, rigorous common sense of detecting design through low probability and specificity. And in my work in Darwin Strikes Back, I was trying to show both the very harsh and focused criticisms of both Michael Behe and those against William Dembski. And I was the most encouraged as I did my research just to see how well the work of Behe and Dembski held up under critical analysis.
Well, very good. Now, I wonder what other areas intelligent design is getting into, because I'm also thinking of Stephen Meyer's Signature in the Cell book, which made a huge impact just a couple years ago. So let me ask you about what your latest book is about. It's entitled The Mysterious Epigenome, What Lies Beyond DNA. And I know that most people are probably familiar with the specified complexity and the information content within DNA and how that can be a really strong argument in favor of ID. But what's the goal in your new book here?
Well, I'd be glad to give you an overview of that. I would like to put a plug in, though, while you mentioned Steve Meyer. He is, I don't know who I would call him. He's maybe the Isaac Newton of intelligent design, since I've said Dembski is the Einstein. So the work of Steve Meyer is transcendently powerful, and just even though his book is a bit of a long read, 480 pages of text with great other notes and appendices, his book is really, of course, on the origin of the first cell. And I think that the fact that it was named one of the top 100 books of the year 2009 under the recommendation of the skeptical atheist philosopher Thomas Nagel really speaks volumes to the power. And Thomas Nagel has become actually today something of an advocate for a critical review of the assumption of atheism, or the assumption of naturalism. I would be better to put it that way. And Nagel has not been, I would say, lacking in courage. He's been strong and firm in his willingness to engage this topic as an example of things to come. Now, as to the Mysterious Epigenome book, it is focused on the layer of code that has been discovered over the last 20 years sitting on top of our DNA. And this additional code, sometimes called the methyl code, is directly attached to certain letters, the cytosine or C letter of DNA, but it's also attached to the tails. There are 8 little tails shooting out from the spools, each of the spools where DNA is wound up within our nucleus. And these tails are decorated with not only these little methyl tags, but other specified chemical letter tags. And so we have discovered, sitting above the DNA, directing the DNA, like an orchestra director would lead the entire beautiful effort to produce music through all of the artists, the musical or players of instruments arrayed in front of him. The orchestra director is like the epigenome, directing the cell to use this gene, but not that gene. And so in our book, we tried to capture the excitement of these discoveries, and we tried to do it in a user-friendly way that would be fun to read. That was one of our goals. We didn't want a book that you would get into and get a headache from or get bored with, but we tried to make it stimulating and a lot of fun to read. And so we think there are heavily coming out from this area of epigenetics constantly and in a very regular pattern. We find implications of design because of the second code. And really the second code has like 6 or 7 layers to it. So it's a complicated, interconnected system of codes, speaking to codes, controlling codes.
Well, I'm curious about your thoughts of just how deep, if you will, that design goes. I mean, when we're talking about biological life here, I mean, some people look at science and they want to say something like, well, the more we learn, the more we don't need God to be part of the picture. But it seems to me like the opposite is the case. Do you see that happening when we look deeper in the cell like this?
That's what Dr. Gills, my co-author, and I, he's a famous eye surgeon, actually has done more cataract surgeries than anybody on planet Earth here in Florida. Dr. Gills and I saw emerging, the more we tried to probe and pry away the layer upon layer upon layer of integrated codes and signaling systems that were zipping across the cell and prompting the opening or closing of different sections, different folders and files within this genetic hard drive of DNA. We were blown away. We were flabbergasted. Our minds were blown, to use the old 1960s or 70s phraseology of the U.S. And as we probed this area, we thought that not only does this give you a glimpse of the brilliance and the complexity of the mind that put this all together, it quite frankly led you into an awe, kind of a startled moment. And even Carl Sagan, bless his heart, he was such a dedicated atheist, but he said, I have my religious moments when I behold this or that aspect of the universe, and I feel a reverential awe. I don't know if he ever directed it in any higher personal target. I don't think he ever did, to my knowledge, even though he had dinner with Philip Johnson, the head of the intelligent design movement, shortly before he passed, when Johnson was speaking at Cornell. But Carl Sagan had this same experience, and we had this awe, this reverential awe of the Creator. Every single new discovery that we included in the book, and we wrote it over a period of 4 years, we were blown away on, like I'd say, at least a dozen, maybe 2 or 3 dozen occasions. And so our next to last chapter, where we revisited some of the new discoveries about DNA, one of our friends described it as like a 4th of July fireworks finale, where all the explosions of colored sparks and booms and bangs are happening simultaneously. And that's what I think we're right now in DNA studies and epigenetic studies coming to something of at least an interim finale. and God, the creator, is exploding the evidence across the universe.
Well, where do you anticipate more progress being made in ID research? I mean, you think we're going to go deeper into the cell? I mean, are there other areas that are sort of unfolding as you see it?
Well, I think in the very area that we were working on in the Mysterious Epigenome book, that this area is to camp on what one of the scholars that we studied said. I forget which one of these scholars made this comment, but I thought it was very apropos, and that is, when we find now, we're tripping across the discovery of these new layers of code upon code upon code, these millions of chemical tags and flags and switches that sit on top of the DNA, and then we find them interconnected in ever more subtle and sophisticated ways. It points to the fact that we are now in the epigenetics revolution where Watson and Crick were in 1953. In other words, we're just learning what the main contours of the system seem to be. We don't even yet know how complicated it will turn out to be, because in our cells, there are about 210 to 225, depending on who you talk to, different cell types, and each cell type has its own epigenetic tagging system. So you have like a separate encyclopedia for the DNA, which is the same in every cell, and then you have 200 different encyclopedias of the epigenetic coding system, depending on what type of cell type, muscle cell, skin cell, brain cell, bone cell. Every one of those cells has its own epigenetic tagging system. Well, where's the intelligence reside that sets up the completely different 200 differentiated encyclopedias? That's the big question, and I think that will be keeping us busy for another 20 or 30 years. And I would say intelligent design is making tremendous strides in astrophysics and also in mimicking through computers the supposed power of natural selection and random mutation. I think the work of Robert Marks and Bill Dembski out of Baylor University and the bioinformatics and computer modeling work they've been doing is just first class. It is world class and then some. And they are showing how these putative or the supposed computer programs that have been written that prove evolution, that prove what natural selection can do, given some random mutations, those programs have intelligence built into them and therefore do a terrible job of modeling what's going on in nature. And so I think that kind of research, which is being done, again, by Robert Marks, who became better known through the movie Expelled, his work is fantastically important, and that gives you another example of where ID research is excelling and where it's heading in the future.
All right, well, good stuff. I want to sort of pick your brain here about how you might advise people like educators or teachers, maybe even like homeschoolers, who may want to get more resources and delve more into intelligent design in their classrooms or in their homes. What sort of advice might you have for them?
Well, I think that it is an exciting time to get into this area. I would encourage anybody, whether educator, teacher, or homeschooler, or even high school student or junior high or whatever, is to read up on both sides. Don't just read up on one side. That's where I think, in my own reading, I think reading Richard Dawkins has been some of the reading that has made me more and more convinced of the correctness and the accuracy and the cogency of intelligent design. Just to read how rhetorically hollow Dawkins' arguments are compared to the best of our own research fellows of the Discovery Institute, that is. And I would say that anyone interested in this area should bookmark two websites. One is evolutionnews.org, which has every day at least one or two or three outstanding articles covering all aspects of design theory and the design movement. That news service is run by Discovery Institute. It's evolutionnews.org. And then another great one, there's a whole half dozen of them, but another great source would be crev.info, crev.info. Our own website, apologetics.org, is where we focus on apologetics, and that's a third source where, by the way, you can see a little 12-minute movie where I and Dr. Gills talk about the epigenome at apologetics.org, and we even include a simulated trip into the nucleus to see the epigenetic system and the spooling process work with the DNA.
Well, excellent. I'll point people to those resources and those websites on the blog post. But Dr. Woodward, you've done a lot of speaking worldwide and on science, ID, apologetics. If someone wants to find out more about your work or how they might get in touch with you and your resources, where can you direct them specifically for that?
Well, I would be glad to direct them to the main, you might say, post office box at our website, which is information, just spell out the whole word, information at apologetics.org. Also, I have an academic email box, and that is just twoodward at trinitycollege.edu. Anyone who wants to reach me can just send an email to either of those e-addresses.
Well, Dr. Woodward, it's been a fascinating interview, and I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Glad to join you for this interview. It's been a lot of fun on my part as well.
I've been speaking with Thomas E. Woodward, professor at Trinity College of Florida and founder and director of the C.S. Lewis Society. Links to his books, Doubts About Darwin, Darwin Strikes Back, and The Mysterious Epigenome, What Lies Beyond DNA, can be found at today's blog post at apologetics315.com. I want to take just a moment to thank you for listening to this podcast, and if you are a regular follower of Apologetics 315, I'd like to point you to our Facebook page. If you like Apologetics 315 on Facebook, you'll just get one update a day with a link to today's blog post, and you'll also be able to interact with others who are fans. If you follow on Twitter, you'll get tweets with some of the best links to apologetics resources throughout the week. So go to either facebook.com/apologetics315 or twitter.com/apologetics315, and you can follow. I'd also like to ask for your support for Apologetics 315 as we continue to grow as a ministry. We are now a non-profit organization, and our growth depends upon the regular donations of listeners like you. And our goal is to provide free, quality resources consistently in order to grow the next generation of Christian apologists. Would you help support this ministry? If so, you can click on the Support tab at apologetics315.com for more information. And if you'd like to listen to other podcasts by Apologetics 315, just search in iTunes for a variety of other resources. Would you like to hear a particular scholar or apologist interviewed? Contact me and let me know at interviews@apologetics315.com. This is Brian Oughton, and thanks for listening.